Good morning, everybody. Welcome again to the PONARS Eurasia Spring Policy Conference. We're delighted that you're here. If you're not familiar with the network, PONARS makes up over 140 academics from North America, Eurasia, and across Europe. It's been around for over 25 years. We have 2 annual conferences per year, and this is our Spring Policy Conference. Today we have 4 panels covering most of the pressing issues affecting people across Eurasia. Most of the presentations that you're going to listen to today are based on policy memos that are available either now online or will be posted very soon. So we encourage you to visit our website and read the written work that undergirds a lot of the presentations. We'd also like to thank George Washington University and the Carnegie Corporation for their generous support for today's event, including the lunch, which we encourage you to stay for and enjoy in a couple of hours. But without further ado, I'd like to turn the
point of view of the global, from the point of view of the global institutions, communicating with the war of democratic Greek city-states with the Persian Empire, or the Netherlands and Spanish Habsburg Empire in the early modern European history. In both cases, or at least cases of Netherlands, we have seen the birth of new forms of democratic organization with the global implications. In my view, we can see the same situation with Ukrainian democracy as the answer for global crisis of democratic representation worldwide. In any case, all experts and political scientists agree that the operation of Ukrainian state institutions during the war has largely exceeded all previous expectations about the resilience of Ukraine in general and Ukrainian state capacity as a state, as economy, as a culture, as a military force. Why did such a fundamental underestimation by Russia and many Western allies of Ukrainian state capacity and Ukraine's political, social, and cultural resources for democratic governance, self-organization, and resistance occur? It seems to me that there are serious challenges here, not only to mainstream approaches of post-Soviet states, Slavic states, but also to the theories of comparative politics in general, how we measuring and evaluating the political regimes in democratic theory. So we can talk about several important changes in the political landscape of Ukraine after the Russian invasion. The first one, maybe one of the important things, the consequences of the year of Russian aggression against Ukraine is the dramatic decline of the role of oligarchs in Ukrainian politics and economy. Ukraine has ceased to be a country where a few super rich people like Kolomoisky, Akhmedov, Pinchuk, Hitler, many others influence politics and government. And the point is not only that during the war their assets were partially destroyed, like Kazakhstan, or nationalized, like Uknafta, Uktatnafta, Motor-Sich, and others. The main point is that most of them lost their media assets, which were an important tool for their political influence. Their lobbying had opportunities to control political parties, individual deputies, or ministers through so-called smart leadership were significantly reduced. So you can see the end of oligarchic system in Ukraine during the war. The second crucial change, now becoming more visible, is the collapse of the old post-Soviet Ukraine party system. which for 30 years is based on competition of pro-European and pro-Russian political forces. Regional divisions used to determine the outcomes of Ukrainian elections since 1991. The Western and Central part of Ukraine tend to favor for the Western candidates, while Eastern and Southern Ukraine favor more pro-Russian ones. Essential elements of this collapse is not only the ban on pro-Russian political forces and pro-Russian political parties, like Opposition Platform for Life, Opposition, Shari Party, Nashi, Opposition Bloc, etc., but the fundamental change in the political attitudes of their electorate caused by Russian invasion. So the war provoked a complex revision of the previous shared history. I mean, a clear reconsideration of the Russian role in Ukraine as a colonial and imperial power, rather than a friendly and friendly nation, братский народ. So, and a lot of empirical research which polls and demonstrates this new perspective, overcoming East and West divide in Ukraine. The third significant change during the war is because clear how successful was the decentralization reform in Ukraine, which increased autonomy of local governments from Kyiv, gave more power, resources, and responsibilities to local communities. So, local governments is one of the main resources of Ukrainian resilience right now. During the war, sharings of critical infrastructure, like power plants and so on. And fourth and last one, it's becoming clear that the war accelerates modernizing of state apparatus and the governance administration, I mean, military forces, law enforcement, taxation, bureaucracy, and judiciary system. War made the state, and the state made war, as I just said. And peculiarities of Ukrainian current nation building is a fusion of elements of state with active and strong civil society. Moreover, some part of civil society becomes the state. I mean, a квартал state. Thank you for your attention.
Hey, thank you. All right, I think now we will turn to our online participants. So next in line is Professor Ivan Gomza from the Kyiv School of Economics. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, and what about me? Can you hear me?
We can't hear him yet. Yeah, just a minute.
Okay. So what about now? Very well.
Good,
okay.
Good.
So it's great to be able to join you, albeit virtually. And today I want to share some insights from my ongoing research on possible midterm outcomes of the Russo-Ukrainian war. And given the lack of time, I will succinctly describe the main assumptions and then present some preliminary findings that I think might be of interest to discuss a little bit later. So even amidst the human misery provoked by the Russian invasion, it is natural to wonder what will come when hostilities stop. And the question is of utmost importance for both academics and practitioners. To build a plausible scenario, we could use passed as raw data. And that was the foundation of my study. I intended to tease out some possible trends in Russo-Ukrainian relations for next 10 to 15 years by exploring other relevant international conflicts. Accordingly, I used a number of parameters. I'm not going to describe them right now, but the number of parameters to select cases appropriate to build a comparative study. And the most significant of those parameters is asymmetric bilateral relations. In different contexts, asymmetry might mean unequal population size, uneven military-industrial complexes, inequitable military budgets, or different levels of societal cohesion. Structurally, however, there are three essential features of asymmetry. First, almost by definition, two contestants enjoy the different amount of resources. Second, asymmetry is historically durable, so that both parties are aware of the lopsided nature of their relations. And third, and the most important, the disparity in resources notwithstanding, the bigger player cannot annihilate or subjugate the lesser. And moreover, attacking the lesser party is costly for the bigger. And consequently, two players, even in asymmetric relations, they must coexist. War, therefore, we can interpret it as an armed negotiation about the exact terms of such coexistence. So using asymmetry and other restrictive parameters as a filter for case selection, I obtained a list of 4 case studies. It was the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and the Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979. Apart from representing the cases of asymmetrical relations, the set I have just described, it offers a number of additional benefits. First, each conflict was of structural gestation. Second, geographically, the cases spanned, as you might have noticed, from Western Europe to Southeast Asia, and as combined, they exemplified different cultural contexts, and thus, when we consider them together, they offer some culture-independent regularities. And 3, each case illustrates what I called the nested dominant power complex. To explain what it means, consider the Vietnam case. Vietnam played a dominant role in relations to Cambodia, simultaneously being a lesser power par rapport to China, and at the same time, China was a secondary power compared with the United States and the Soviet Union. And that nested dominant power complex, it sheds additional light on each of the cases I worked with and the Russo-Ukrainian war as well. So I am aware about the lack of time, and I'm not going to focus on any other methodological issue. And now I'm moving directly to 8 important regularities of the midterm war effects that must be accounted for. So number 1, first, war resulting from asymmetric relations rarely goes according to the pre-war plans because each participant nurtures misconceptions about its adversary. In 1870, Prussia intended to conduct a limited war, but was mired in a people's war. France, at the same time, expected to be supported by the southern German principalities, but instead had to face the German Union. In 1973, Israelis were convinced that Egyptians, they could be contained with superior air power, only to realize that missile had banned the aircraft's wing. And simultaneously, Egypt crossed the canal to push for a diplomatic settlement, only to miss the opportunity and get a worse deal with its Third Army unexpectedly encircled. I'm not going to dwell on the other cases, but we had the same misconception, which played a very important role. So as a result, we see unpredictable developments and unintended consequences. The conclusion is also relevant for 2023. The brunt of unintentional political outcomes, it is manifest with Finland joining NATO or Germany issuing Russian energy supplies, and there are many more to come. Second important regularity, whether a lesser part wins, loses, or results are unclear, the outcomes of a military conflict do not resolve problems of asymmetrical relations. On the contrary, Tensions and hostilities are to be expected unless mature asymmetric normalcy is established. With respect to the Russo-Ukrainian war, it is imperative to see over the narrow horizon of ceasefire or even a peace treaty and elaborate on strategies that could normalize the asymmetric relations between these two countries. 3. Even in transition from a hot war to a cold peace is actually very demanding, and it requires 3 steps: formal diplomatic relations reestablished, mutual respect for sovereignty, and an institutional framework to contain and resolve issues of disagreement. And unfortunately, the 3rd component, it is really essential, and it is most difficult to be achieved. The cases when countries eventually reverted to hostile stances, like France after 1884 or Vietnam after 1985, they lacked precisely this framework to contain and resolve issues of disagreement. So it is something to be established between Russia and Ukraine. 4. Normalization hinges upon regional and global international relations structural shifts. And this is consistent with the previous point. For instance, by 1910, Russia abandoned resentment toward Japan after it first settled its differences with the Great Britain, which was Japan's partner. And second, both countries, I mean Japan and Russia, they joined the camp opposing the Central Powers. Likewise, Egypt established durable relations with Israel at Camp David after it had opted for the US patronage. And conversely, Sino-Vietnamese relations, they remained poisoned 10 years after the war until Vietnam joined ASEAN. So what I'm trying to say is, that is my interpretation, that normalization between Russia and Ukraine will not be reached unless Russia abandons its hostile attitude toward the West, which would signify the shifts in the IR structure. 5. War effort is taxing on society. So the populace demands something in return from the political elites. And as a result, episodes of political contention, protests, are to be expected regardless of whether the country wins or loses. To illustrate, there were 2 French uprisings, one against the imperial order in 1870 and the second against the republican order in 1871. There was a Russian Revolution of 1905, the Japanese Hibiya protests of 1905, the Israeli demonstrations of 1976, and the 1977 Egyptian bread riots. A notable absence from the list of protests and contention is or are Vietnam and China, and it suggests that only polities with considerable state capacity can manage the popular discontent. However, wars, they more often erode state capacity than not, which foretells some troubles for both Russia and Ukraine in a mid-term consequences. 6. Regimes that suffered defeat or failed to conclude a preferential peace, they will face mounting discontent from the revanchist or hardline segments of the population. In particular, a nationalist backlash against governmental policies is to be expected. Illustrative are the cases of the French La Ligue des Patriotes, the Russian Black Hundreds, the Israeli Gush Emunim, and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And unlike the unrest, which I have discussed previously, which is transient, extremist organizations, they tend to implant into societies and profoundly affect the societal climate. By extension, we should brace ourselves for occurrences of right-wing extremism, especially in and emanating from Russia. 7. Asymmetrical wars alters the nature of civil-military relations. For victors, it exacerbates the prestige of the military, whose members enter politics and bureaucracy, enjoy a greater say in governmental policy, and influence political decisions from behind the scene. For losers, it causes frictions between the political leadership and the army, because the army is blamed for national humiliation. As a result, the military tend to morph into an anti-regime breeding ground, like France, Russia, and Egypt illustrate. One way or another, for both Russia and Ukraine, the typical post-Soviet way of civil-military relations, when military is actually remain apolitical, it is likely to be over. And finally, in asymmetric relations, leadership is paramount for initiating hostilities, peace settlements, and normalization. The wars I studied, they would not have erupted without Bismarck and Napoleon, Nicholas II and Katsura Taro, Deng Xiaoping and Le Duan, and Anwar Sadat, because each of those leaders, he promoted their agenda and was directly responsible for hostilities. And likewise, normalization, it was purposely opted for by Nguyen Van Linh and Jiang Zemin, by Sergei Witte and Ito Hirobume, by Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. And when no such leadership was available, like in the Franco-German case, normalized asymmetrical relations remained unattainable. Therefore, as long as Putin stays at power, or at least does not modify his policy, Russo-Ukrainian relations, they will remain off balance. Thank you for your attention. As we say in Roman, ancient Rome Parliament, Dixit.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yes, so for the online, thank you for the fascinating presentation, and we got 2 great presentations so far. So let's turn now to Tetyana Malyarenko, who will be presenting her research together with Boris Kornich.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So my presentation is a follow-up of the presentation that I made in September in the PONARS conference, and the article that I published with my colleague from Odesa, Professor Boris Kornich. So what has changed since September? First, Ukrainian army succeeded in returning a part of the territory in the north and south of the country. At the same time, Russia is entrenching itself on the occupied territory, extend its political institution and conduct a special occupation policy. So my presentation will be about varieties of Russian occupation policy in Ukrainian territories, and I want to demonstrate both the shift and continuity in Russian occupation policy. Also, general geopolitical and geostrategic goals of Russia in relation to Ukraine has not changed. Russia for several times adjusted the goals of so-called special military operation, lowering the bar according to its military capabilities. The tactical goals of Russia, at least for the current moment, is to hold the Ukrainian occupied territories. Our analysis of Russian occupation policy, including the policy regarding de facto states, which we consider as the occupation by proxy, demonstrate both continuity and shift in ways and means of occupation policy. The most and foremost continuity is the subordination of Russian occupation policy to Russia's geostrategical goals. So Russian occupation policy is an adaptive tactic of Russia's grand strategy. Several factors are worth noting. First, it is a change of Russian approach to conflict management on the post-Soviet states from reactive, when Russia opportunistically used conflict in post-Soviet country as a leverage to influence the policy of these countries, to proactive, when Russia creates a conflict in other countries. Just to follow argument of Sergei Markedonov, who is now cancelled for his pro-Russian position, there are 2 generations of conflict in post-Soviet countries. The first generation of conflict appeared as a result of dissolution of Soviet Union. The second generation of conflict resulted as a result of geopolitical competition between Russia and the West. So Russian annexation of Crimea and proxy war in eastern Ukraine could be considered as conflict that have significant component of artificiality and instrumentality. We understand artificiality as the intensification of violence and creation of condition of conflict between the conflict of parties which until then had no unresolvable contradictions by third parties, so Russia. And instrumentality, we understood instrumentality as the usage of constructed conflict as a leverage to impact domestic and foreign policy of the country. The second factor is the change of Russia occupation policy, is that the Russian occupation policy is a manifestation of the process of de-modernization and modernization of Russian strategic military culture. So we consider the adoption of a comprehensive approach to warfare, so-called Gerasimov doctrine, including informational, cyber, economic, diplomatic, war, and occupation policy through de facto state as an element of modernization Russian military strategic culture, and on contrary, the return to barbarian conventional war is a manifestation of demodernization of Russian strategic military culture. The third factor is also the Russian occupation policy implemented either through direct occupation or the proxy occupation is an adaptive tactic. Our empirical study confirms the argument that Russian occupation policy differentiates between the territories of geostrategic values and the territories which Russia considers as less valuable for itself. The difference in approach is particularly visible when we consider economic policy of Russia toward the occupied territory. So to support our argument empirically, we collect materials and combine empirical and 4 case studies, which themselves are grouped between 2 larger case studies, so-called new and old occupied territory. So we consider the case study of Crimea, when Russian policy could be described as an entrenchment. So, you know, empiric from Crimea just briefly illustrate that for the time of annexation, Russia increased its military personnel from 12 to 32,000 of people, stimulate, according to UN report, migration about 140,000 of Russian citizens to Crimea. However, the most tangible shift took place in economic sphere, and the creation of free economic zone in Crimea allowed to attract about $28 billion of investment, mostly from Russia's state budget, to agriculture, construction, food industry. Then Crimean economy grew more than 2 times. However, it's still below the Krasnodar Krai, and about 20% of population lives below the poverty line. Nevertheless, most interesting that Russia exported not only political institution, but its economic model to Crimea. That means that small and medium-sized enterprises, which were the core of Crimean economy before the annexation, significantly decreased in number of registered enterprises and the personnel employed in this enterprise. Unlike Crimea, Russia did not export its political institution, economic policy to self-proclaimed Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, in just investment in very minimal range to support survival level of local population through social payment to school workers, government agencies, army, police, and as a result of the Donbas general GDP occupied territories in 2020, it's just 40% of its pre-war level, and industrial output of occupied territory became 3 times lower than government-controlled territories, while before the war it was on contrary. But most interesting is to observe Russian occupation policy on new occupied territory and differentiate between different parts of the occupied territories. And our study demonstrates the most Russian investments and the most Russian intentions of policy are put on territory which are located along the land corridor from Rostov to Crimea. For example, to Mariupol and Novazovsk, but not to the old industrial cities of Donbass, Donetsk, Lugansk, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, etc. In new occupied territories, along the Sea of Azov, unlike Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic, which Russia used to recognize as Ukrainian before the illegal annexation, logistics with Russia developed very quickly. So Russia constructed a railroad connection between Kherson Oblast and Crimea, between Zaporizhia Oblast and Donbass, between Zaporizhia Oblast and Crimea. And according to Russian government, they started to build high-speed rail connection between Rostov and Crimea. And we have some interesting data from statistics that Mariupol is recognized as the biggest construction in Russia now. And among of 60,000 of Russian construction workers employed on occupied territories, 38,000 work in Mariupol. And construction, of course, is financed from the Russian state budget. And for example, it's also interesting to observe how Russia exports its political institution and government officials to different occupied territories of Ukraine. And our analysis of the composition of government of 4 annexed territories appointed after their formal incorporation into Russia show that composition of government in so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic has largely remained the same. And the newly appointed member of government in the so-called republic are natives of Donbass, while members of the government in Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast are former Russian officials. And the difference of occupation policy to new and all occupied territories also manifests in different approach to mobilization to the Russian army. In so-called People's Republic, they are subject of forceful mobilization, but in the occupied territories of Kherson and Zaporizhia, the Ukrainian citizens can participate in the war inside of Russia only on voluntary basis. And one important and interesting aspect is the different educational policy. In old and new occupied territory, in Donetsk and Lugansk People Republic, education policy relied mostly on its own human resources, libraries and equipment. And even when they changed textbook, they changed textbook on history of Ukraine to history of homeland, when they describe how Donetsk people were created, what is their identity. But on new occupied territory, Russia directly transferred a textbook history of Russia and Russian school teachers there. So, but our study confirmed that regardless the type of occupation policy, in all cases, occupation led to de-modernization and de-industrialization of the territory, occupied territories. In the case of Kherson in Zaporizhia Oblast, it may be less visible because the major industry of this occupied territory is agriculture, so they could be incorporated to the Russian agriculture industry. But territories of Donbass, taking into account that almost complete destruction of urban and industrial infrastructure, no investment, they can become the new wild fields they were before they captured by Russian Empire in 18th century. So what is the policy conclusion from this study? So as Russian-Ukrainian war can be equation with many unknowns, Ukraine and its international partners should pay attention not only the occupation policy after when Ukrainian territory returned to Ukraine, but what we have to do now to not to allow Russia to enrich occupied territory, but also to save life of local Ukrainian population here. So thank you very much. I'm done with this presentation.
Okay, so I understand Tymofii Brik is here. So I'll just wait to call him up. He is rector of Kyiv School of Economics, so very busy. We're very happy that he can join us. Okay, I see him there. Tymofii, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for introducing me, and I apologize for delay. I'll be sharing my slides in a second, and I'll present our work, which is a joint, paper together with my colleagues, Hale, Benedict Herman, and Felix Rosel. This is a team of policy and academic researchers who are involved in decentralization, who have been involved in the decentralization reform in Ukraine as policy analysts and researchers. So together we came up with this paper, and it is forthcoming in the Journal of Comparative Economics in the special issue dedicated to Ukraine. So this paper is specifically about the role of decentralization in shaping trust to local government to Ukraine. And when we started this paper, we approached it from a very specific angle. We just wanted to understand the process of decentralization, to evaluate it, to understand whether it was successful or not, because there is some policy and sociological scholarship on this matter, arguing that social trust matters, that trust to institution matters. And on the other hand, we know that Ukraine has been described in the literature as the society with low levels of trust to formal institutions and to government specifically. So we wanted to, to test whether decentralization can change something. At the same time, fast forward into our days, we also understand that the role of local communities has been pivotal in resilience during the current full-scale invasion by Russia. So we observed that local communities were mobilized to defend their land, and also to support local resistance and to support government and to fight back against Russia's soldiers. So now we have this new angle in the paper. We also want to understand whether decentralization as a policy that happened, in 2015, had any possible impact on this local trust to local authorities, since we're interested whether it can explain partially what's happening now. So the way we address this research is following. We want to test whether the policy reform had an effect to increase the levels of trust to local authorities. And we will study specifically new communities, or the so-called amalgamated communities, or in Ukrainian hromadas. In 2015, the reform happened, creating new administrative units, communities that were amalgamated based on some villages and towns. They received new political capital, political influence, but also a significant share of taxes retained at the community level from now. So there are quite a lot of incentives, for communities to be engaged with this reform. At the same time, we know that it took some time. That, there were some pioneering communities. Some communities were first to adopt this reform, and for some years they existed simultaneously with other types of communities that were not quick enough to amalgamate. So we can take these different types of communities and compare their performance in terms of trust to local authorities. So to do this, to Descent, we employ microdata on trust from the Life and Transition survey, which includes about 3,000 respondents, and about 10% of them lived in these new types of pioneering amalgamated communities. And we make this assumption, that the absence of decentralization would have developed. So if we compare these two types of community, we make assumption that the absence of decentralization would have generated the same levels of trust, just like in any other community. So to test whether this holds or not, we apply difference in difference models to this survey data. So this is just for the context. This is not the data that we are analyzing. This is the national level data by National Academy of Science showing a certain divergence. At the national level, we observed that the trust to local government increased after 2015, while the trust to national governments hasn't. So now we want to understand whether our better fine-tuned models with life and transition survey can explain this divergence better. So what we have on this map with black dots, we mark these pioneering communities. As you can see, geographically, they are spread all around Ukraine. They're in the western parts, eastern parts, central, southern, north. So there is no some specific, geographical factor or something like that. But we also control for some other variables like demography and economic output before the decentralization. And basically, to cut the long story short, we run this difference in difference model, and we see that there is indeed, we observe that those respondents who live in these specific pioneering amalgamated communities, that after the decentralization, the levels of trust to local government increased in these communities significantly, and we do not observe the same effect for trust to national or regional government, parliament, president. So it's only about local government. So the probability to report trust in local governments increased by 17% in these pioneered amalgamated decentralized communities, and we don't observe other types of trust being increased. So still you can debate, why exactly this happened. There are kind of alternative mechanisms that can be tested. On the one hand, you could argue that perhaps decentralization makes communities, just better because they tailor their resources to public services. They provide better public services, and people are more happy with the government. On the other hand, you can also argue that the very process of creation of these communities means that people have to engage, they have to come together, they have to decide how to amalgamate, which villages should come together, they vote for the new mayor, they decide collective problems together. So they become kind of more active, more engaged as citizens, and the trust to each other increases, and this transforms into trust to local government. So these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but these are alternative explanations. We also try to test these mechanisms in some other models, and we see that indeed trust to general social trust increases. So people say that most people can be trusted in these new pioneering communities, and also increase to neighbors. Trust to neighbors also increased. And we do not see satisfaction with some variables that were available in the data, like local roads or water supply. So they did not report that they were satisfied with these public goods, which is partially evidence to the second mechanism. Yes, that there is some sort of a booster increase of general social trust and trust to neighbors, and this can also have some spillover effects and correlate with trust to local government. There are some limitations of the study, of course. So life and transition survey goes only till 2016. So this is only 1 year of reform. You can argue that maybe, not enough of time passed since the reform, and maybe we need to wait longer to see some increase to national government or satisfaction with roads and water. So it can be the case. We also do not control for local political circumstances and incumbents and their role. Nevertheless, I think the fact that we captured this quick transformation, this increase to local governance in Ukraine, the country that was perceived as a low trust society to formal institution, is still remarkable. And we add to some literature beyond our region, literature about social trust, because there is a lot of debate whether this is possible or not, whether institutional change can stimulate change in trust or not. So I think we provided yet another different evidence that it is possible. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to talk about this research Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
So now we are. We okay?
Still here, echo.
Outset that I'm a State Department Foreign Service officer who's on detail to the Wilson Center and the Kennan Institute in particular. And so nothing I say or the questions that I ask today should be assumed to reflect the views of the US government, the State Department, the Wilson Center, or the Kennan Institute. These are essentially my own thoughts. I also want to be clear, I'm not a scholar, I'm not an academic, I'm a foreign policy practitioner. I don't consider myself an expert on Ukraine, although I worked on Ukraine in the State Department from 2014, 2015. And then I spent 3 weeks in Ukraine during that time. So my familiarity with Ukraine stems from my general focus in my career on the former Soviet Union and Russia and on political military issues. So I just want to say that at the start. Also, as a government official, I obviously condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is President Putin's war of choice. It was and is unnecessary and unjustifiable. And sadly, it has caused incredible suffering and loss of life within and outside of Ukraine. And as a diplomat who is dedicated to working for the peaceful resolution of disputes, I urge Russia to end the war as quickly as possible and to recognize Ukraine's sovereignty. So that said, moving to these excellent presentations, I will start with Mr. Fisun, since we started with your presentation. I would say that it's safe to say that as of today, Russia's aggression has consolidated Ukraine's national identity in a way that the Kremlin probably had not predicted and certainly did not hope for. All Ukrainians are now rallying around the flag. Ukrainian ethnicity and language are now more important than ever to the people of Ukraine and are tied to Ukraine's national heritage and pride. Many Ukrainians who lived in and still live in Ukraine's east and who speak Russian consider themselves Ukrainians without question. That's what I understand. So Russia's aggression has made it clear to most Ukrainians now who their enemy is. Russia is seen as a mortal enemy bent on doing away with Ukraine and will be assumed to be the main threat against Ukraine well into the future. To Ukrainians, it is clear that Russia's aggression is due to much more than the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO. The people of Ukraine have been very clear about their desire for good governance and transparency. President Zelensky has been focused on countering corruption, as well as vigilance by civil society and media to ensure effective monitoring and accountability of public procurement and to hold those in positions of public trust to account. And I believe it's important that we continue to stand with Ukraine as it works to implement important anti-corruption reforms. Ukrainians are concerned about the long-term effects of living under occupation of the Russian military. President Zelensky is taking on the oligarchs, but the problem of the oligarchs cannot be resolved overnight. And then I guess if I'm allowed to ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay. I guess my question would be this: are there any people residing now in Ukraine who may be concerned with martial law as it exists now, and how it might affect them after the war ends? Other than Russian speakers and people who may be considered ethnic Russians, are there other groups in Ukraine now who might be considered suspect in terms of their loyalty, and whom the Zelensky government might want to engage now to allay their concerns?
Okay, thank you. So Oleksandr.
Thank you for your review and your comments. I think that we can see now a very interesting situation of consolidation of the Ukrainian nation on the ground of democratic values and on the ground of Ukrainian national civic identity that overcome previous religious, ethnic, and linguistic divides and cleavages. Roughly speaking, West-East divide in Ukraine. And paradoxically, Ukraine, in a situation of a state of emergency and martial law, produced very interesting trend to formation of very interesting hybrid state of democracy, which combine military state organization with informal civil society organization. In defense sector, I mean territorial self-defense structures and volunteer movement. I think that one of the outcomes of this situation is the formation of this hybrid system that may form a democratic perspective after the end of the war. So my answer, Ukraine is a paradoxical state because Ukraine demonstrates no authoritarian transformation during the very hard times, during the martial law and state of emergency. Moreover, we can demonstrate very interesting rise of democratic orientation, not only in the western and central part of Ukraine, but even in the south and in the east of Ukraine. So, as demonstrated a lot of different opinion polls and surveys. So, in my view, Ukrainian experience is unique. It has profound consequences for democratic theory, for comparative politics, and how we understand sense of democracy and sense of democratic values. In my view, we have a lot of similar features with ancient Greek city-states in confrontation with Persian Empire, and Netherlands during the confrontation with Spanish Habsburg Empire. Greek city-states, Netherlands, and Ukraine creates a new form, a republican organization based on military force, based on military self-organization of free people as a basic of republican idea. So my answer is very good.
Okay, thanks.
Shall I keep?
Okay, yeah, please,
Proceed.
please.
Yeah. Okay, with the other presentations, yeah.
Yes.
So for Mr. Holmes's presentation, thank you very much for that. That was, by the way, that was excellent. Thank you, Mr. Fisun. For Mr. Holmes's presentation, as a person who's concerned myself in the State Department mainly with political military issues, I particularly fixated on this one and really enjoyed it. Also having served in the Middle East and seeing the consequences of the Yom Kippur War there, and also in Vladivostok, where the people still remember very vividly the Russo-Japanese War. So, in terms of the presentation, I don't really have any critiques of the wars being presented and the lessons potentially being drawn from them. I definitely sort of put an asterisk by ourselves that we should brace ourselves for extremism in Russia. There was the comment about how when a country, when a conflicting power loses, that tends to breed resentment there. And I think that is something that we'll need to watch out for. And of course, leadership is paramount for ending wars. I definitely agree with that. I would say that there's a general consensus among experts that I deal with that Putin's war against Ukraine is likely to go on for some time. That the war fighters on both sides are rather equally matched overall. That strategists generally say that the advantage goes to the defender, but that is not always the case, and that the longer the war drags on, the more possibilities there are for surprises and unexpected developments. And that was addressed in another presentation about how war plans are usually the first casualties of the war, right? And all sorts of unintended consequences happen. That said, I would say that Ukraine has a strong sense of self and a desire to live independently. This was seen in the late 1980s, exhibited in such things as the Ruk movement and the human chain that stretched from Kyiv to Lviv. Ukrainians were some of the first of the former Soviet peoples to demand independence for themselves, and Ukraine was one of the 3 former republics that dissolved the Soviet Union. This spirit of independence may have ebbed and flowed over the last 30 years, but the defense of Ukraine carried out by its men and women, a glimpse of which I observed when I visited Ukraine in 2015 in Dnipro, is and will be a significant factor in how the war plays out. I would say also that in terms of lessons learned from this particular war, that Putin's war against Ukraine is a wake-up call for all of us, that most people want peace, and yet we must recognize that any time there are people out there who are willing to exert their will on others, using force if necessary. So if there's one thing that we have to learn from this particular war, as also from the previous wars that were looked at, it's that we cannot be lulled into living in our comfort zones, and we cannot be lulled into refusing to rise up against a gathering threat to peace. So it is understandable when people want to live in denial of what they see before them. That's actually sort of natural human behavior, but we cannot do that anymore. We must assess in a very sober and clear-eyed way what we have seen and are watching unfold before us now in Ukraine, and that this war has focused us all to cross the Rubicon. That is to say, there's no going back to what existed before. That just simply is not possible. So that would be sort of my comments on Mr. Holmes's paper. And then if I have 2 questions from Mr. Holmes, right? I think the first would be from Mr. Holmes. In Ukraine, how much agreement already exists among the government, the army, and the people about how the war ends? And is there a general consensus concerning whether Russia must renounce its claims on lands that it says it has annexed, including Crimea? And the second question would be, what are his thoughts on the degree to which Russia can be held accountable for its conduct of the war going all the way back to 2014, starting with the seizure of Crimea?
Actually, maybe if it's okay with Ivan and the others, maybe we could save the responses to the end. So maybe we can collect some feedback from the audience before the others respond, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay, so moving to the next presentation, Piper. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Too much paper. think that would be, excuse me, I've got too much paper in front of me. Who's the next presenter? Was it Tetyana?
Tetyana, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Tetyana's name, thank you. Okay. I particularly like this paper. I like all of them, sorry, all the presentations. Let me be clear about that. I liked the sort of the concept of the war aims shifting and the tactics shifting, and I think as someone who graduated from the National War College, where we study national security strategy, and we look at how wars are fought and try to draw big lessons from them. That's one of the things you tend to see during wars, that the ends will change. And of course, her very good point, I think, about the kind of what they call the special military operation, sort of setting the bar low, right, so that you could adjust it as needed. And of course, Soviet Union and the Russians, certainly in the Soviet period, are sort of masters at propagandization and changing the narrative, whenever that suits them. So it's just something for all of us to bear in mind. I think I would say that while she has put out the evidence, or sort of the empirical evidence or examples that might suggest, different approaches to new and old occupied territories, I don't think it's clear that Russia has a plan ultimately for the lands that it has occupied. If Ukraine were able to retake control of the Donbass and Crimea, it seems to me that it would be hard to deal with them due to the heavy Russian propagandization that has taken place in those regions. And she described all the special efforts that Russia has made in Crimea in particular. We have seen that Ukrainian forces have regained control of parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia, and these regions seem to have adjusted to this reality relatively quickly. So maybe that reflects some of what she's been talking about. One of the things that probably we need to look at would be what would be the impact of the return of Ukrainians to Ukraine after the war ends. And I don't know that it's clear to us how many Ukrainians will return after the war ends, when it ends. It will depend probably to a great degree on whether there are jobs for them. And many have been welcomed where they currently are, and that's a kudos to the host nations. Those in places of refuge where children may understandably not want to return. That's understandable. And then I would just also say that while it's questionable that Putin's war on Ukraine has had an impact on governance and society in Ukraine, and especially in those areas that have been occupied so far, it's also had an impact on Russia. It will have an impact on it for years to come. As a general observation is that war puts the societies of the warring parties into flux. The conduct of the war and how it ends will inevitably remold the people of Russia as well as Ukraine, and I think that touches on several of the presentations here. Assuming that the war in Ukraine proves ultimately to be a loss or a draw for Russia, those involved in engaging the Russian government and the Russian people afterwards will need to work to ensure that the Russian people learn the truth about the war and learn the proper lessons from it. That's not going to be an easy task. And that's all the presentations. We can see if I have a
Tymofii, Brik.
Yes,
Thank you
very much. Organized on my paper. I had to write a lot. I'm learning a lot.
No worries.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to learn about you. Yeah. So Timothy's point about how it's changing, or his paper on how the war is affecting trust in government. I guess I would say from the outset that I'm not surprised by the data. I mean, there was obviously going all the way back to 2014, the Minsk agreements and things. There was obviously this whole effort of discussing decentralization. It was going to be part of the Minsk agreement, right? So there was kind of recognition even back then. Some things have to change. And on that, I would like to underscore that it's important that when we think about Ukraine, right, it's very easy now to focus on this massive invasion that's going on now. That's very overt that started in February 2022. But the reality is, and I remember this vividly, having worked on it at the State Department, that the Russia's aggression in Ukraine started back in 2014. So this war, and that was a more discreet, you know, there was obviously an effort of deniability there that Russia was behind. But this war has been going on in Ukraine for over 9 years. So it's just a worthwhile reminder. And I would only underscore now, I guess, that Ukraine's military did not unravel. I think, as someone else pointed out, it rightly exceeded everyone's expectations. The democratically elected government under President Zelensky did not collapse. And despite what some people say, I would definitely assert that Ukraine is not a failed state. In fact, it's rallying as we're seeing. So those are very encouraging signs. And I think I have 1 or 2 questions for him. Let's see if I. Two questions for Mr. Brik would be two more comments, I guess I would say. Wars are inherently transformative, and made his observations on these thoughts, right? That the US has changed considerably since its founding, and much of that change, for good or bad, occurred as a result of the wars that we've been in, including our own Revolutionary War. While waging a defensive war, the Zelensky government, in theory, could make considerable progress in fighting corruption, instituting reforms, and resolving any long-standing historical disputes that Ukraine may have with its neighbors. And the second observation that I would love to comment on would be, you know, every time that the US has gone to war, we've had to confront issues after the war concerning how we treat people from the countries we were fighting, how we treat veterans from the war, how we come down off of a war footing. And so I would just welcome his observations on the return to normalcy. These are not going to be easy issues for Ukraine to deal with. To the extent that it can spare the expense, I would say the Ukrainian government might now want to start looking into these matters with a view to what it wants Ukraine to look like in the future, so that it has some sort of roadmap that it can follow and has identified problem areas that it can try to avoid or at least start to address during the war. I think that's it. Thank you very much. Sir.
All right, terrific. Thank you so much. All right, so those are a great set of comments to get the discussion off the ground. So I think before we return to the panelists, I think what we'll do is we'll go to the panelists at the end of the panel for a few minutes of responses. But before we go back to them, we'll ask them to respond not only to Michael's comments, but also to whatever comments we have or questions from the floor. So the floor is open. Yes. Sorry, wait for, just ask you, wait for the microphone, please, and then yes, identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Murat Ilyasov, Miami University. I have a question to probably all of the panelists. My question is, if there are some voices from the population that that would show the signs of wariness of war and would encourage Ukrainian leadership to consider some kind of peace agreement or steps towards it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have other comments, questions? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Oleksandr. I'm also from Kharkiv, and now I work in the Center of European Policy Analysis. My question is about post-war Ukraine. We've had really good presentation of historical perspective, what happens after the wars, right? And my concern is there any signs that Ukraine can get into some kind of militarization government, some military coup, or some kind of, how to say it, well, something which will change the civil government into military government, some kind of militarization of government.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here in the front. Just microphone is coming.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. I just wanted to point out, in answer to your question, are there entities within Ukraine that are unhappy? And I'd point to the Hungarian population on the border. They at one time controlled all that territory, and like any revanchist people, they would love to have it back, just the way the Finns would like to have Karelia back.
Okay, thank you. All right, I think if there are no more questions on the floor, we'll turn things back over to the panelists. Maybe this time we'll go in the reverse order. So we can start with Tymofii, then go to Tetyana, Ivan, and then Oleksandr. And we have about 10 minutes left, so I just ask each panelist to try to keep your remarks to 2, hopefully no more than 3. So I apologize, it's a constrained amount of time, but please do your best. And thank you. So let's turn to Tymofii.
Tymofii is experiencing a problem technical. He's rebooting his computer.
Okay, then maybe we can go to you, Ivan, first.
Okay, I'll do it in the reverse order as well, and I'll address the question about the possible military coup. So the point I was making is, yes, the civil-military relations are always altered after a war, either it is lost or win. However, in the Ukrainian case, and here I somehow can say that my argument is overarching with Professor Fisun's, in Ukraine, we can expect not a military coup, but rather a new influx of military coming to policy. Think Ariel Sharon in Israel, who built a very impressive political career after being a military commander. So you can expect people in Kharkiv coming to politics, switching the track, but not like people from barracks driving tanks against the Verkhovna Rada. At least that is my reading. About war weariness, well, for the moment of being, there are no such indications because, first of all, don't forget, for most of the Ukrainians, this is the existential threat, and you cannot say, well, let's postpone it. I mean, for the moment of being, to protect the sovereignty is the biggest issue, and under adrenaline, will tend to fight for it. So we don't see it yet. However, it might come in a year because I do agree with our moderator that this is a long conflict and we have to endure. Next, about the consensus on war aims in Ukraine, the question which was addressed to me. Well, for the moment of being, there is this consensus, and namely, Ukraine has to recover all the territories, including Crimea. So the territories which were taken, occupied, or annexed, so the boundaries of 1991. And here is actually a problem, because I think it is an official war aim, and it is shared both by population and the governance. But maybe, let's say in a year, the question of Crimea will still be unresolved. Let's say that Melitopol is taken back, Mariupol is taken back, Donbass is taken back, but Crimea is not. And then there must be a political solution which might produce a cleavage, a rift between the population willing still to continue fighting and the government opting for the political solution. And that might bring the dynamics of societal discontent against the government. But once again, we are not making this prognosis yet because the situation is being decided on the ground. Thank you.
So I see one question online from Oleksandr to Ivan, so maybe I'll just pose that to you, which is, could you sketch the framework to resolve disputes between Russia and Ukraine after the victory based on your insights from Egypt? And so maybe if you could just very briefly address that, and then we'll turn to the others.
So very briefly, as I put it, we should consider the war as the situation of deteriorated relations in the asymmetrical dyad. And the way to normalize the situation is that first and foremost, the sovereignty of both participants must be recognized. So when Russia does it, when it recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign state, not a running away colony, not a part of Russia which for some malicious historical incident become a part. So when Russia recognizes Ukraine as a sovereign state with its identity, its statehood, then the particular framework of how to normalize those relations is to be elaborated. Think about Israel and Egypt. Egypt recognized Israel as a sovereign state, not like a bunch of idiots to be pushed into the sea, as Arabs used to do it prior to the Camp David. And after that, different initiatives actually helped to normalize first relations with Egypt, and then with the whole most of Arab world. So, but the main issue is the recognition of sovereignty. This is actually the main political goal of Ukrainian struggle.
Okay, thank you very much. So now let's turn to Tetyana.
I firstly address question relating to me. So I agree that policy of Ukraine toward occupied territory should be also different and differentiate between old and new occupied territories. In any case, the first desirable scenario is quick deoccupation, which not allow Russia to entrench on these territories. In case of Donbass, it will be slightly easy, let's say in this cynical term, because a significant part of territory is destroyed, and population policy, as our commander said, it could settle the issue. So we can attract more Ukrainian population to go to Donbass after the occupation and live in new cities. In question Crimea, it will be a difficult task. Also, Ukraine has to propose some special policy of reintegration of local population, again, after the occupation. And it was very important question about population move. And because I'm now in Germany, I see a lot of Ukrainians who live in Germany, and they also consider option not to return to Ukraine. Like Ukrainians who left Donbass also consider option not to return to Donbass. So I think it is very interesting topic for future research to study how Ukraine look like after the war, when population, to which part of Ukraine population will move and from which also move. And related to question of militarization, I don't think that Ukraine will be too militarized country, in particular in comparison with Soviet Union when we grew. But of course, we expect new elite would come to government, and new industrial sectors, I believe, will be constructed in production of contemporary weapons. So, but it not be so critical. And that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think Tymofii has made it back. He's had technical issues. So let's turn it to Oleksandr. And there has been at least one other question posted to the chat. I don't know if you'd like to address it or not. Maybe if we have time, we can go back to one of the other panelists if they'd like to. But it asks us to please address the consequences in Ukraine of having society now so gender unbalanced, with millions of women and children having left the country. So,
thank you. Was the research is the future research agenda of Ukrainian studies, in my view, can be connected with clarification of the question, the extent to which current changes of Ukrainian state, politics, economy, and society, political landscape are caused by the war and a state of emergency per se, as consequences, or to what extent they are outcome and continuations of the Euromaidan reform. For example, reform of de-organization was started by Zelensky in 2021, the collapse of party system code in 2019 after the electoral success of the servant of the people. Decentralization started under Poroshenko in 2014-2015. The Ukrainian revolutions of 2004 and 2014 Maidans legitimized the active role of civil society as the main driver of political change and regime change in Ukraine. Did the war only help and intensify these tendencies that Euromaidan previously shaped, or would they only have been complete and fully realized with the war situation? And did the war paradoxically help destroy the old post-Soviet oligarchic political and economic system in Ukraine and destroy its ideological and culture base by consolidating a new Ukrainian civic identity? In my view, further research may provide an answer to this question.
Okay, thank you all. Unfortunately, I think Tymofii has not managed to come back, but we're very grateful for all of his and all our colleagues' efforts to address technological instability and difficulties that face us. But we're really glad that we're able to have you together with us, at least virtually. And so thanks for a great discussion. Please join me in thanking our panelists and our discussant.